Been mixed reaction to the arrest of Belinda Magor. This follows a voice note that did the rounds on Friday. In the voice note, Magor calls for black people to be banned instead of pit bulls. The Gauteng Premier Tseliso Thipanyane confirming her arrest on Twitter and on social media generally. The South African Human Rights Commission is also probing the incident. With so many calls for harsher punishment, how do you deal with Equality Court litigation? We are joined now by Advocate Tseliso Thipanyane. He is the chairperson of the South African Institute for Responsive and Accountable Governance, previously with the South African Human Rights Commission. Advocate Thipanyane, thank you for joining me. So, Tseliso and others who did the groundwork to unmask the identity of this alleged racist whose voice note is doing the rounds, truly offensive and denigrating, abhorrent voice note that is doing the rounds. The route one that they are taking is to basically go the route of criminal charges. What is the arsenal there in terms of getting this acted upon in a criminal fashion? We will turn to the civil processes in a moment, but criminal charges seems to be route one. How effective is that as things stand in our law?
Good afternoon to you and to our viewers. No, definitely, these statements are quite horrible and quite disgusting, to say the least. And therefore, as far as criminal law is concerned, the charge will be a criminal injuria. Like Mombek, who used the K word. It's actually quite more serious because the lady is actually calling for violence, not only against black people in general, but also against women. So definitely the courts have to deal with this matter quite harshly in terms of criminal law.
Oh, no.
It does definitely incite violence and hatred.
Sorry, Advocate Thipanyane, the line broke there for a moment, and so for a moment I was saying, not again, okay. This is happening to me once again in terms of the quality of the line. So it's a bit challenging because of the challenges that we face that affect the network. But let me ask you this. You say that criminally, this is crimen injuria. That's a common law crime, is it? And does it necessarily mean that it is weaker in terms of what can be done compared to what could potentially be done had the hate crimes and hate speech bill progressed as far as it should have, to the point that it would have come into effect by now?
Well, to a large extent, because the Hate Speech Act will basically consolidate our common law and strengthen it in order to make sure that it does work well in ensuring that we deal with this kind of conduct, which, as I said earlier on, threatens our democracy and our social fabric, and actually calls for violence against black people and women in particular, especially in 16 days of violence against women.
And in terms of the prosecution of crimes like these, do we have a body of work that shows that beyond taking a person to the Equality Court for civil redress, actually the system in South Africa takes it seriously as a crime, and this gets followed on, and you do end up serving a sentence either of imprisonment or other forms of sentences?
Yes, if you recall, Ms. Mombek, many years ago, when she called, she used K word, she actually went to jail. And I think the remarks by Belinda are even worse than that of Ms. Mombek, by calling violent women black women and say people must be shot and killed. So one hopes that our courts will act in a much harsher manner than they did with Ms. Mombek, and sentence this lady to a long, lengthy term of jail in this regard.
Yeah. In fact, while the line continues to sabotage us there, I'd like you to talk to me a bit more about the content that we are dealing with here, because in the courts it ends up turning on the question of whether what the person said is merely quote unquote hurtful, in the sense that it might cause a person to be upset, but the debate ends up being about, does it amount to advocacy for violence and calling people to action to actually harm groups that are sort of designated within the law around discrimination. When you listen to that voice note, and I only listened to it once because really I don't want to give racists, any power over me and any time of day, really. They should be dealt with through the systems that we have established and dealt with harshly. When you listen to that voice note, what's your sense of what is aggravating about it compared to the Momberg case?
Well, in this case, Belinda is calling for black people to be killed, calling for violence against women, that black women's ovaries must be cut out, that, we are worse than pit bulls. So it's definitely hate speech in the most horrible, horrible manner and quite disgusting. And one really hopes that our criminal justice system will really act quite harshly and decisively in dealing with this kind of matter, because it underlines, the views which basically informed racism, which informed slavery, which basically perpetuate violence against black people. It's completely unacceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. And lastly, Advocate, because the line is really sabotaging us, the question of civil redress under the Perpuda Act, the Equality Act, there was some debate some time ago about its constitutionality of one of the provisions, which wasn't a model of clarity, and that was meant to be remedied. How far are we with that, as far as you know?
Well, the Constitutional did set the law much more clearer in terms of the Equality Act, Section 10, on what constitutes hate speech. And therefore, what this remarks falls within that interpretation of the Constitutional that hate speech should be that speech which incites violence and hatred against other people and also perpetuates hatred. Therefore, the Equality Courts should deal with this matter as hate speech and be able then to use the provisions of the court to pass reasonable sanctions against Belinda.
All right. Advocate Tsipanyane,
by way of civil action, which will mean a lengthy fine.
Yeah, unfortunately, the line really got in the way in terms of our conversation. But I believe we got as much as we can from you. And I really appreciate your time and insights here on eNCA. That's Advocate Tseliso Thipanyane there, weighing in on that issue. He is the chairperson of the South African Institute for Responsive and Accountable Governance, with a fair amount of experience around these issues of equality legislation litigation.